James G. Blight, The Fog of War, Lessons from the Life of Robert S. McNamara. Delve into the fascinating insights of James G. Blight's The Fog of War, Lessons from the Life of Robert S. McNamara, as we explore vital topics such as empathy, international relations, and the role of rationality in conflict resolution. Drawing from the experiences of former U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert S. McNamara, this engrossing work examines the complex aspects of decision-making during crucial historical moments, such as the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Vietnam War. Through these in-depth evaluations, the reader will discover how a greater emphasis on empathy may hold the key to achieving peace, aiding world leaders and citizens alike in understanding different perspectives and averting catastrophic consequences.
Learning from history. Former U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert S. McNamara participated in oral history conferences to bridge the gap between the one-dimensional, outcome-focused narratives presented in history books and the confusion of raw experience, as recalled by critical decision-makers during the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Vietnam War. The goal is to learn from the mistakes of the past and ensure a more peaceful future by understanding the complexities and nuances of historical events. The power of empathy in international relations. Ralph K. White and Robert McNamara agree that empathy is crucial in facilitating international relations. Lack of empathy leads to conflicts and miscommunication. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, McNamara and his team were able to view the situation from the Soviet perspective and averted nuclear war. However, their failure to empathize with Vietnam resulted in the deaths of 2 million Vietnamese and 58,000 Americans. Understanding the opponent's thoughts and actions is key to finding peaceful solutions to conflicts. Rationality and empathy in avoiding nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis revealed the importance of exercising rationality with empathy, as conflicts often arise due to misperceptions and misunderstandings. Former U.S. Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, emphasized that rationality is necessary but insufficient in preventing a nuclear war. Kennedy's decision to pursue a nonviolent solution with Khrushchev prevented a catastrophic event, but it also highlighted the fundamentally divergent perspectives on the crisis between the U.S. and Cuba. While Khrushchev believed that Castro would be pleased with the plan, Castro was furious and saw the U.S. occupation of Cuba as inevitable. For him, the only way to eliminate the danger of U.S. imperialism was to devastate the United States with Soviet nuclear weapons, even at the cost of Cuba itself. McNamara reminds us that to prevent future conflicts, rationality needs to be exercised with empathy, and that requires the willingness to understand and empathize with an adversary's perspective. Lessons from the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis showed that the combination of human error and nuclear weapons can destroy nations. The Kennedy administration believed that attacking Cuba was safe as they had a bigger arsenal than the Soviet Union, but they didn't account for Castro's possession of nuclear weapons and willingness to accept extinction. Castro argued that the only way to prevent nuclear war is to eliminate nuclear weapons, and powerful nations should avoid making smaller countries feel helpless as they may resort to nuclear war as their only option. The Vietnam War tragedy. The Vietnam War was not a sudden mistake, but rather a culmination of flawed assumptions and miscalculations. This mistake led to an extended conflict where millions lost their lives. Decisions were made based on wrongly imagined strikes and fears of political weakness rather than concrete evidence. The North Vietnamese military was more decentralized than the Americans believed, and the first attack on the USS Maddox was ordered by a local general without approval from higher-ups. The United States assumed that the attack had been centrally approved by North Vietnam to escalate the war. In reality, the North Vietnamese anticipated American intervention, and the United States was secretly interfering with South Vietnam even before Kennedy's assassination. When America began bombing, North Vietnam saw it as proof of the Americans were bent on destroying it, which only made it more determined not to bend to U.S. pressure. The Vietnam War demonstrated that war is beyond the ability of the human mind to comprehend all the variables. The responsibility of a just war. The book questions the just war and explains how some atrocities committed during the war were not proportional to the goals set. The author argues that evil acts are not legitimized even if winners deem them acceptable. The book discusses how, even in war, norms govern the treatment of human beings, and most nations agree that civilians should be immune from attack. However, during World War II, both sides largely ignored these norms, resulting in atrocities such as the United States killing 100,000 Japanese civilians in one night during a firebombing campaign in March 1945. Regardless of whether the U.S. fought a just war, it still committed atrocities for which guilt is the only appropriate personal and national response. The author contends that the conventional explanation for such acts is that they were necessary to end the war. However, this belief is self-righteous and self-justifying, and it protects U.S. citizens from prosecution by the International Criminal Court and has justified a number of wars. The author ultimately argues that evil acts are not legitimized even if the winners deem them acceptable or conclude that there were no other feasible options, and proportionality should always be a guideline in war. JFK and the Vietnam War. John F. Kennedy's evolving stance on the Vietnam War, as revealed by newly surfaced documents, challenges previous beliefs on his commitment to the conflict. John F. Kennedy's beliefs on totalitarianism and communism were well documented and featured prominently in his speeches and senior thesis at Harvard. However, newly discovered documents related to the Vietnam War have challenged the conventional understanding of his stance on the conflict. Kennedy's skepticism of military and intelligence advice, which he learned from the Bay of Pigs disaster, and his handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis, suggest that he was capable of altering his views based on new information. The documents also reveal that Kennedy was planning to withdraw from the war before his assassination. Former Defense Secretary Robert McNamara believed that if Kennedy had lived, there would not have been 500,000 American soldiers in Vietnam. The implications of Kennedy's evolving stance on the war are significant and challenge previous beliefs on his commitment to the conflict. Learning from mistakes. American officials failed to learn from past mistakes, as demonstrated by the silence surrounding the invasion of Iraq. The lack of accountability and willingness to accept feedback hinders progress and raises concerns for future crises.
As we reach the end of our journey through McNamara's wisdom, the most significant takeaways lie in the power of empathy and our capacity for understanding others. By diving deep into events such as the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Vietnam War, it becomes evident how a lack of empathy and mismanagement of rationality led to devastating outcomes. On the other hand, employing empathy during international decision-making can greatly improve diplomacy and contribute to more peaceful resolutions. Ultimately, the fog of war highlights the importance of empathy, open-mindedness, and humility as indispensable ingredients for ensuring a more harmonious future.